all for coming. Southwestern Oregon Community College's Anthropology and Sociology Speaker Series. My name is Dr. Dana Furman. I am so excited to introduce Temple Grandin. Temple has had an amazing career. She is a professor in the Department of Animal Science at Colorado State University, and I wrote this all down just to make sure that I got it right. She really has had an amazing career that spanned multiple disciplines. She starts in the animal industry and really revolutionizes how we treat the livestock that we love to eat, right? Now she has become, since then, she was basically one of the first people to publicly speak about her experiences with autism. And she has written numerous books and articles on both subjects. Please help me give a warm welcome to Dr. Temple Grandin.
Well, it's great to be here tonight by Zoom, and I understand that I'm talking to an anthropology class and a psychology class. I always like to know who I am talking to. And I'm going to be talking about different ways that people think and solve problems. We can go to the next slide, please. And we need the skills of people who think differently. In fact, I discussed that in my new book, Visual Thinking, The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions. We need people who think differently. Okay, we're anthropologists. Well, who do you think might have made the first stone spear? It wasn't the social yakety-yaks around the campfire. It was somebody with a mild case of autism figuring out how to attach a chipped rock, to make a stone spear or to make a bow and arrow. You see, that's a person that's not so social, probably made some of the early inventions, the early humans. We need the skills of the people that think differently. The dyslexic people, the autistic people, the ADHD people, they have unique skills. I tell business leaders, you need neurodiversity because you just need the skills. Let's go to the next slide. And the first step is learning that thinking is different. I think completely in pictures. And if you saw the HBO movie about me, it shows exactly how I think. I thought everybody thought that way until I was in my late 30s. And I didn't know that other people didn't think in pictures. And I was shocked when I learned that some people don't think in pictures. And I'm going to draw a little diagram, show you how I figured this out. I was at an autism conference and I asked a speech therapist, think about a church steeple. How does it come into your mind? Now I see individual churches. They come up like PowerPoint slides and I name them off. They are very specific. And the speech therapist just saw this pointy thing. Hardly any representation, almost no visual thinking. That was a shock to me to discover that some people think almost entirely in words, and it affects their ways that they solve problems. Let's go to the next slide. Now, I work with animal behavior. Being a visual thinker really helped me because the first thing I wanted to do was look at what cattle were looking at. And people thought that was kind of crazy to look at what cattle are looking at. But if you think visually, it's obvious. Animals live in a sensory-based world. I do a lot of talks to veterinarians. You want to understand animals. You need to get away from verbal language, totally get away from it. What is it seeing, hearing, feeling? It's a sensory-based world. There's a really interesting book called An Immense World that goes into all the different kinds of senses that animals have, like octopuses live in a total touch world. Let's go to the next slide. Now, and this is a chute where cattle would walk up here to get vaccinated. See how there's a reflection right there at the entrance? You might have a time of day effect, and that will make the cattle stop and refuse to move through the facility when you get that reflection. We tend to not notice those things. Let's go to the next slide. Now, visual thinkers will see something to risk. They'll see a way to solve a problem, or they'll see it. The mathematicians calculate risk. Different ways of approaching thinking. I'm a big NASA fan. So 6 years ago, I visited this launch pad when it was under construction. And the next slide shows something that was in the launch pad that I don't think really ought to be in there. And I watched a raccoon come out of it. And I said, did you know that a raccoon is in there? And they were using that base as a workshop for fueling equipment. I saw equipment in there that I don't want a raccoon around. Let's go to the next slide. You see, there's different approaches to problem solving. Object visualizers like me, the picture thinkers, will see something that's a risk. We'll just see how to make a piece of equipment work. Mathematicians calculate risk. It's pattern thinking. And a lot of our school system today rewards the mathematicians. We're getting more and more math requirements. In fact, what's happening in science, and I don't like it, is they're saying everything has to be quantified. What happens to observation and research? Anthropology is a field where a lot of it was done with observation. And some people today don't think that's research. Well, what is the Hubble Space Telescope, the James Webb Telescope? There's no control. They just observe and look at things like hundreds and hundreds of galaxies. Astronomy is purely observational. And the verbal thinkers, they discuss things. But I'm concerned that science is going more and more mathematical. And if you don't have a control group in an experiment and quantify everything, it's not science. I think that is a problem. There is a place for observation in science. And anthropology is one field where observation is really important. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there's three basic different kinds of thinking. And when you get somebody that's autistic, you tend to get the extreme. There's object visualization, then there's mathematical thinking. I'm an extreme object visualizer. I'll show a list of the things that I'm good at on the next slide. Go to the next slide. Okay. People like me are good at inventing mechanical equipment, art, photography, working with animals, and making things, figuring out how to make things. This is what the object visualizers are good at. And we're terrible at algebra. I'm seeing algebra as a barrier. It's keeping a lot of kids out of fields like anthropology and wildlife biology and things that they could be very, very good at. But they have problems with higher math. I'm one of those. Never have passed algebra. I managed to dodge it. That was one of the reasons why I majored in psychology. I was absolutely fascinated with optical illusions. And I think that helped me see the shadows and the things that spooked the cattle. Let's go to the next slide. Now, the mathematicians, it's patterns. The mathematical mind thinks in patterns. My kind of mind thinks in pictures. Music and math, that goes together. And then art and mechanical things go together. I know that sounds weird, but it just works out that way. So the mathematicians go to chemistry, engineering, mathematics, computer programming. But let's look at method sections on scientific papers. I'm reviewing a paper right now, and they haven't told me what the breed of the cattle is. I think that's a very big problem. They don't fully explain the methods. They go do 5 pages of statistics, but they don't tell me what they fed their animals. It matters. These details matter. Did they get supplements? Did they just graze grass? You know, what did these animals eat? That can affect the results, and that's left out. I've seen that over and over again. In other words, going all mathematical, but not telling me exactly how you did the experiment. I've looked at some papers for artificial intelligence. Well, I don't review the computer part, but I look at the training data set. Okay, if it's about cattle behavior, how did you observe that cattle behavior? Did you scan sample it? Was it continuous observation? It matters. What kind of cameras did you use? This matters, and it matters a whole lot. And I'm seeing method sections and papers are just absolutely horrible these days. Let's go to the next slide. And then, of course, you have the verbal thinkers, writers, lawyers, teachers, psychologists. Now, let's look at the subject of animal consciousness. I have a chapter in my new book, Visual Thinking, about animal consciousness. And some people still don't think animals are conscious. And I think it gets down to verbal thinking. If you're an extreme verbal thinker, you might have a hard time imagining that a dog is conscious because it cannot think in words. And then I'll look at where the papers come from. Psychology department, philosophy department. Those are the departments that the papers come out of where they more likely to not think an animal's conscious. Computer science department, the mathematicians are fine with thinking animals are conscious. And us visual thinkers, we know dogs are conscious. That's not something that I'm going to discuss. Plants are not conscious. I reviewed a book called Planet Sapiens for the New York Times, and they were saying plants are conscious. I'm going, nope, nope, nope. They got nervous system-like functions because of the Venus flytrap. That's like a reflex, but plants have no central processor where incoming information and outcoming information can mingle together. sort of like a great big hub airport. Or to put it in another way, I like analogies. There's no Intel inside. There's no central processor. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there's research that shows that the object visualizer like me and the pattern thinking mathematician are very different thinkers. Autism can come in three different kind of extreme types. Object visualizer like me, extreme mathematician, lots of them work for the tech companies, and then the verbal thinker. This is the guy that loves history, loves facts. And they're often really good at doing retail jobs like selling business insurance or cars, where they have specialized knowledge of the merchandise. They do really good on that. Let's go to the next slide. And a lot of people are mixtures of the different kinds of thinking. But when you get a label, autism, dyslexia, ADHD, personality, something or other, communication disorder, you tend to have people that are more extreme thinkers. Now, the problem with these labels is they're not black and white categories. It's a continuous. When does a little bit of nerdiness become autism? It isn't like tuberculosis where you have it or you don't. It's not specific. It's a true continuous trait. When does slightly nerdy become autism? There's no black and white dividing line. And then now the way they have the diagnostic categories, you're going from Einstein at one end to somebody who has nonstop epilepsy and can't dress themselves at the other end. Let's go to the next slide. Turns out I got some big visual thinking circuits in my head. We'll just show off another one of these brain scans on the next slide. And you can see that these brain scans are old. This technology is sitting in the local hospital right now. Nobody's using it. And then one of my earlier books, The Autistic Brain, I go into details about the brain scans. You'd think they'd be a bit more interested in it. The machine is right there. You can use it for free at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then nobody's doing it. Let's go to the next slide. Now let's look at how different kinds of thinkers take in information. Object visualizers like me want to look at pictures. I like to look at pie charts. I always go look at all the tables first in the paper. The verbal thinker wants to read it. Mathematician will look at both, but I just hate going through the results section of a paper in text. Let me look at the tables, and I like the graphs even better. Let's go to the next slide. Now, this is an interesting study where they had art students, science students, and humanities or literature students do a drawing of a planet. They had to invent planets. Oh, you can imagine what the art students did. Skyscrapers, crystals. Science students drew a circle and told you about the gravity in the atmosphere. And the humanities students just made some splotches. But you know what was shocking about the literature students, the word thinkers? They did absolutely no planning. You see, in word thinkers, you have concepts like we got to do social justice. I don't know what that means. You see, that's not specific. That's a big, broad concept. Now, I can think of a specific example of social justice using DNA to free a prisoner that did not commit the crime that he was accused of. All right, that's an example of something real that you could do with social justice. And that's also something I can see. But there's a tendency to have, big, vague concepts. But how do we actually do it out in the field? Let's go to the next slide. Verbal thinkers overgeneralize. Top down, really linear, leaving out the details. My kind of mind's associative, jumping all around. And so it's two different kinds of thinking. So the verbal thinkers get frustrated with me because how can I be talking about driving to the airport and the next thing you know, I'm talking about cell phone towers. That's because I saw one while driving to the airport. I just saw a new short cell phone tree coming home from downtown Denver today. You see, this is sort of how the pictures pop into my head. Let's go to the next slide. Let's look at our early inventors when the patent office first started. They would have been object visualizers, a blacksmith who made grain harvesting equipment, bicycle mechanics. The Wright brothers invented the plane. They were just the visual thinkers. They weren't doing much math at this point. Let's go to the next slide. And what's a problem we got today is the people that are, I call the clever engineers, the ones that can fix anything, the ones that keep our factories going, that build complicated equipment for factories. The people I worked with, they've all retired. and they're not getting replaced. There's a relationship between education and what's going on out in business. The kids that need to be fixing elevators, and believe me, I've been on a lot of questionable elevators lately. They're playing video games in the basement on autism diagnosis when they ought to be fixing things. But the problem is the schools took out the hands-on classes, so the kids never found out it's fun to fix things and use tools. You've got to get exposed to stuff to get interested. Let's go to the next slide. Half of all large 3D printers come from Europe. We'll go to the next slide. And the state-of-the-art electronic chip making machine, think computer chips, that comes from Holland. Even though the mathematical research it's based on was done here, the machine comes from Holland. That's because in 9th grade, you can either go university route or tech route, and they don't stick their nose up a tech route and think of it as a lesser form of intelligence. I'll tell you, it's a different form of intelligence. Let's go to the next slide. And you can look at all the mechanical gadgets that this thing has for my kind of non-mathematical mind to work on. Let's go to the next slide. I'm the one who'll find the one connector that won't work. The electron microscopes come from Germany. And you go to the next slide. The parachute cloth for the parachute that landed on Mars came from the UK, woven on high-tech European looms. Let's go to the next slide. And then right before COVID, I visited the Steve Jobs Theater, and I'm screaming in the middle of it, we don't make it anymore. And I talk about a lot of stuff we're not making because we took out the hands-on classes. The glass walls come from Italy and Germany. Let's go to the next slide. We've paid the price for taking out hands-on classes. Now, a lot of colleges are putting them back in. CSU, where I'm at, really big on putting in all kinds of hands-on stuff in the engineering department. That's really good. But the problem is we've screened out the students who can't do algebra. Some of the best hands-on people can't get into college because they can't pass the algebra requirements. I mean, they have all kinds of math requirements becoming a doctor or a veterinarian. I don't know any doctor that uses calculus. And there's only a tiny bit of algebra you need for drug dosing, and that can flat be memorized. We got kids today totally removed from the world of the practical. I had a girl in my class who had never used a ruler in her life. When I did a book signing 5 years ago for my kids' project book, Calling All Minds, 20 to 30% of the kids in the suburb of Denver had never made a paper airplane. And I go, and they're going to make policy about stuff in the future, important stuff like water and things like that. I can tell you over there in Libya, somebody should have listened to the visual thinkers. They were warning them about the dam. The bureaucrats didn't listen. Really, really bad results when the dam broke. Let's go to the next slide. My grandfather was the co-inventor of the autopilot for airplanes. MIT-trained mathematician, worked with an autistic man who came up with this really crazy idea for an autopilot. Everybody thought it was crazy. Oh, after all, anyone who knew anything about airplanes was trying to connect the plane's steering to the magnetic compass. And if you ever used a magnetic compass, this is what the plane's going to be doing. Wiggling around all over the place. Well, they worked really hard on this. And unfortunately, the stolen version was in every warplane during World War II. They needed a lawyer. It's where they needed a verbal thinker. Let's go to the next slide. Our educational system is screening out the optic visualizers. I still can't do algebra. And thank goodness when I went into a little tiny startup college back in '67, the entry math class was probability matrices and statistics. More stuff to visualize, and with a ton of tutoring, I was able to do it. I don't know what I would do if I was in the state of California. I don't think I'd graduate from high school. But let's say somebody waved a magic wand. I'm 18, low income. What would I do? They let me keep my knowledge, heading straight for the chip factory or straight for the Amazon warehouse. Because you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to design the next one. Because I've seen people do that in the meat industry. Get a job on the line, migrate over to maintenance. 10 years later, they're in charge of the new plant addition. Yeah, I have seen people go in that back door. Let's go to the next slide. Well, the owner of this plane cannot do algebra. He took one welding class. 30 years ago, he built a tiny cattle handling facility for our experiment station. Now he's building beef plants all over the country. And he earned that jet. I'll tell you that right now. And I was about crying when I went to get on that jet, because I go, here's somebody has a really super good career, and he can't do algebra. Let's go to the next slide. Well, there's a hydraulic power pack that he built. If you know anything about hydraulics, that's a thing of beauty. That runs every piece of equipment on the beef processing floor. Let's go to the next slide. And this is a plant under construction, a piece of equipment I worked on, the center track restrainer for beef cows, and every single big plant's got one now. The guy who built the first one was an undiagnosed autistic, owned a shop. Oh, I can look his name up on Google Patents, and all kinds of patents come up. You know, sometimes the tendency for the degreed engineer, for the mathematician, to say, well, these people just manufacture. I can tell you, the guys in the shop don't just manufacture. They invent stuff. I worked with them. Even though they might only have a high school education and one welding class, they are inventing equipment. I call it the clever engineering department, and they're not getting replaced. Let's go to the next slide. Now, who builds a big food processing plant? My kind of mind will lay out the whole entire factory, do all the drawings, and make the mechanically clever equipment. Think packaging machines and things like that, mechanically clever equipment. And then the mathematical engineer, the degreed university-trained engineer, does the boilers and the refrigeration, makes sure the roof doesn't fall down. I don't understand boilers and refrigeration. None of us touch that. This is where you need to have the different kinds of minds working together in a complementary way. This is really important. They have complementary skills. Let's go to the next slide. And when we did my visual thinking book right here, I did the rough drafts, not very well organized. And Betsy Lerner, my fabulous co-author, she straightened out everything and made it all flow. That's different kinds of minds working together. And I used co-authors on a lot of my books. Now, the stuff that's on my website, grandin.com, no, I wrote that. Somebody just wrote me an email and said there was mistakes all over my website. I don't know if it was a scam or it was for real. I just deleted it. Let's go to the next slide. Let's look at how we have collaboration on building a building. The architects make it look nice. The engineers make sure it's safe. You see, you need to have both. Let's go to the next slide. 20% of the people I worked with when I was out in heavy construction for 25 years, all through the 70s, 80s, and halfway through the 90s. A lot of these people were autistic, dyslexic, or ADHD, all undiagnosed, owning shops. Now they won't let the special ed kids take shop because of liability. I worked with special ed kids that own the shops, multiple patents, and most of them were terrible at abstract math. Let's go to the next slide. It's a different kind of thinking. I have grandparents that come up to me all the time. They discover they're autistic when the kids get diagnosed. They all had good jobs. Now, where that autism diagnosis helps them is with their relationships. That's where it helps them. You know, any parents that got diagnosed later in life, they'll like this book right here, where grown-ups tell about their experiences getting diagnosed, and it's helpful on the relationships. Now, for me, one of the things that's made life really interesting is having an interesting career. This is why I put so much emphasis on career, because that's something that gives me satisfaction in life. Because I'm a person who gets friends who shared interests. Oh, a good plane ride for me was sitting next to a lady who ran construction sites, and we talked about warehouse construction and the things that are wrong with it, and concrete forming. That's a good flight. Boy, that's interesting stuff to talk about. Let's go to the next slide. What I want to ask you is, what would happen to some of the top innovators in the past if they were in today's educational system? Let's go to the next slide. Michelangelo, grubby little 12-year-old, dropped out of school, but he was running around in all these churches because they were all making great art. So he's exposed to great art. And he grew up with stone cutting tools. You see, that's exposure. Then he started making things, and then he was pulled into a studio and mentored. So how do you get into careers? First of all, you have to be exposed. And then the next step is mentoring. And I had some very, very good teachers. I had a wonderful science teacher when I was in college. Really, really helped me. And I had some people out in business that were helpful. And then once I was a little kid, My mother taught me how to read by reading out loud. Let's go to the next slide. Steve Jobs was probably on the spectrum. Bullied in school. I was bullied in school. And the only places I was not bullied was friends who shared interests. Things like horseback riding, model rockets. My science teacher was the model rocket coach. Those were places where I had friends. Einstein had no speech until age 3. Definitely would land in an autism class today. Let's go to the next slide. Thomas Edison was probably autistic, dropped out of school, but he learned how to work. You know, a lot of kids that are autistic are not learning how to work. They're not learning enough life skills. You know, I say to parents when kids are 11 years old, they need to get things like church volunteer jobs, work at the farmer's market, or walk the next door neighbor's dog, where they're doing a job for somebody outside the family. Let's go to the next slide. And here's another autistic person, brilliant in rockets, brilliant in cars, brilliant with mechanical things, brilliant with engineering. I don't know about Twitter, X. I really love his work in rockets and cars. I think it's just fantastic. Something social, not so easy for an engineer to do. Let's go to the next slide. He was horribly bullied in school. And you might want to read Walter Isaacson's new book about Elon Musk. It is very interesting. Now, another reason for keeping all of the hands-on classes in the schools is a Nobel Prize winner was 50% more likely to have a hands-on creative hobby. But when I was really happy that the Nobel Prize in Medicine, I'm terrible at remembering names, but there was a lady scientist that was having all her grants rejected for mRNA vaccines. Grant after grant after grant rejected. And then one day, she meets the right person in the copier room, and they get the Nobel Prize. This is why you need to go to the office. I'm not kidding. That is the story. No more rejected grants after that. She's the co-inventor of mRNA, the Moderna COVID vaccine. Yeah. You need to go into the office once in a while. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, here are some tips for working with the minds that are different. If I was a computer, I have tons of long-term memory, but I got a very small processor. I have a slow processor speed. This is why I have difficulty with high-speed chit-chat conversations, and I'm not going to be good at rapid multitasking at the McDonald's takeout window. The other thing I need is if someone just yaks out a whole verbal sequence of instructions, I can't remember that. So if they're telling me how to close out the cash drawer at Walmart, I need to write it down. I need to make a pilot's checklist and write it down. The other thing is, a lot of people who think differently have sensory issues, problems with flickering with fluorescent lights, or maybe the kid can't stand the noise of the tools in the shop. You know, it's the way to get over that. Go down there when nobody's in the shop and take that electric drill where you're turning it on, you're making a noise, drill holes and all kinds of stuff where you are making the noise, and then you can learn to tolerate it. You can do that with little kids that are autistic. Have them play with the vacuum cleaner where they turn it on and off. And that vacuum cleaner may go from a horrible, scary thing to a fun thing when they make the noise. And don't wear headphones all the time to shut out the noise. It's going to make the sound sensitivity worse. Have them with you so you have control, but don't wear them all the time. And we've got to limit the video games. And you know how you can get the adults off the video games? Car mechanics. There's a man named Danny Coombs in Denver, and he's teaching autistic adults, the video game addicts, to fix cars. Car dealers are hiring them right and left. The kids find out that the cars are more interesting than video games. So the visual thinkers that are addicted to video games, replace it with mechanics. And we need people to fix elevators and escalators. I don't know. They've got a broken escalator at the Denver airport that's had a portable wall around it for months and months and months and months. And let me tell you, that wall's getting a great patina of getting dented in by bags. It's been there so long. Let's go to the next slide. What's the ultimate goal of education? Where's a student 10 years after high school? Everybody thought I was stupid. They didn't think I'd amount to anything. I did my first big design projects exactly 10 years after high school. Let's go to the next slide. And when you're weird, you know what you got to do when you're weird? You sell your work, not yourself. I show people my drawings. That's a drawing I did in 1978 for the Dip Vat that was shown in the HBO movie. I showed off my work. Okay, if you're a photographer, you can show a portfolio of your photography. Let's go to the next slide. The next slide is the drawing I used to sell Cargill. I designed the front end of every Cargill beef plant. Did that late 80s and through the 90s. And I sent that drawing right there to the head of Cargill. 30-second wow. Show my work. Let's go to the next slide. And that was one of the pictures I sent. And we'll go on to the next slide. And that's a replica of one of my projects that they built for the movie. I love the fact that the movie showed how I think visually, and they recreated all my projects. Just love that. That's the nerd side of me. Let's go to the next slide. And I had a really nice brochure. You know, freelance is a good way to go. You go in, you design the project, and then you're out of there before you get involved with all the office politics. Let's go to my last slide. I'm not going to show all the slides in this deck, because what I'd like to do is let's open it up for questions. You know, the rest of the slides talk about teaching autistic kids working skills, teaching them life skills, and some additional things on sensory. And one of the big ones is flicker on LED lights and getting a lot of exercise. That's important. All right, let's do some questions. Now I can see some of you sitting there. So I might pick somebody that I can see sitting there, unless somebody wants to go up to the mic and ask me a question.
Yeah. You just raise your hand.
Can she hear us?
Yes.
Yep, I think I can hear you. Yeah.
It's less of a question. I just wanted to say Temple Grandin is a really cool name, like just in general.
Oh, well, thank you. The Temple was an old family surname.
Anyone else?
Well, I want to get some. I'm going to pick somebody. We've got somebody in a cool orange shirt thing. I like the bright colors. Maybe she has a question.
I'm trying to think of one, Temple, but I loved your presentation. But somebody has a question over here. I'll try and think of one.
Well, I just want to get you thinking. Now, is this the anthropology class or the psychology class I'm talking to right now?
This is both, and a number of our community members. So they kind of separated themselves a little bit. There's like psychology over here and anthropology students over here. It's kind of funny. But education. Oh, and there's education here too, Temple.
Oh, there's education. Okay, good. Because originally you told me it's anthropology and psychology. And education has a lot of verbal thinkers. And one of the things that gets to be a problem is a lot of very top-down abstract things. Like, let's say we talk about an inclusive classroom. All right, I'm going to tell you things to do for an inclusive classroom.
Yeah.
I want to get rid of the LED lights that flicker. You build a new school, please don't put in LED lights that flicker. And I'll tell you how to make sure you don't have them. Pull this thing out right here and take slow motion video. And you know, and sometimes the expensive ones flicker. Let's get rid of that, because that's going to bother about 10 to 20% of your special ed population. That's the one thing. I wouldn't do checkerboards and stripes in the classroom. Other than that, you know, decorate it however you want. And lots of hands-on stuff for a lot of these kids, making things, work reading and math into things. These kids get fixated on cars. Let's read about cars. Let's do math with cars. Take that thing they're fixated on and broaden it.
And then we've got a question right here. He's kind of out of
Okay.
the camera here.
Hi, Temple. I'm a parent of adult autistic children. Neither
And
of
how old are the kids?
the oldest is 31, the youngest is 29 next month.
What are they doing now?
Nothing.
And are they fully verbal?
Yes.
So what do they do all day?
My younger son likes to read religion, and my older son is convinced that the only thing he can ever do is take care of his mother.
And is he doing a good job of taking care of his mother?
He's doing okay, but he forgets things.
The other thing is mom might like to go out on an outing to a restaurant or shopping. It's one of the things he needs to do to take care of mom.
He's okay at taking care of mom, but for example, I took him on vacation, but he left the refrigerator door open and spoiled all the food that was in
Well,
it.
then maybe he needs to have some checklists. You know, the pilots have to use checklists on every single flight.
Checklist would be
Use a
good.
checklist for things like to make sure the refrigerator door is shut, that you do all the steps.
I like that idea. My younger son is convinced that he cannot be independent. And his motivation is zero about doing anything other than just staying in his room and watching TV or reading a book. And I'm
You see, now some of that is anxiety.
struggling with
Causes
yes,
that.
he is full of anxiety. He's trying
And
medication.
one of the things that really helped me, I take medication. That's completely described in my book, Thinking in Pictures. As I went through my 20s, my anxiety got worse and worse and worse. I had colitis attacks that just wouldn't stop. I was terrified of airplanes. I had all kinds of things that scared of, and I've been taking a low dose of an antidepressant for 40 years. That's all described in here. And the big mistake that's made with antidepressant drugs like Zoloft or Prozac is too high a dose. The label doses are too high. Take too high a dose of an antidepressant for anxiety, you're going to get agitation and insomnia. And even though this is more than 25 years old, it's still accurate.
But
Drugs
not
have not changed.
James, you had a question?
Yes. Earlier in your presentation, you were speaking about complementary types of thinking. Are there ones that work against each other? Like, what would you say is like the two incompatible ones?
Well, it's the personalities are the things that tend to get more incompatible in the ways of thinking. Because for lots of things, like, okay, like when we wrote the visual thinking book, when I did this book right here, there's no way Betsy could have looked up the research and stuff I put in that. But the editors look at my stuff and it's all too choppy and jumping all around. Then Betsy goes in there and smooths it out. What we deliberately did there is use our different kinds of skills, knowing that they're different, and using the strengths of our different kinds of skills to turn out a really decent book. That's using complementary skills. You know the old thing, artists hate the accountants? Well, the thing is, they need an accountant so they don't go broke. You know, that would be the example of complementary skills. The first step, and I talk a lot of businesses, is realizing that different kinds of thinking exist. I didn't know they existed until I was in my late 30s. I was shocked.
And you have a question?
Yeah, someone else, I can go. I would like to know what advice you would give to parents who get a diagnosis young with a child, say, under 2 or around 2 I think is what's normal. What would your advice to parents be for any type of really early work or intervention?
Oh, you need to be working with the kids. I got into excellent early intervention, excellent. And I got speech therapy, where they worked on teaching me to talk. And these kids are like a slow computer. You've got to give them time to respond. The other thing that was a big emphasis in my very early therapy when I was 2, 3, and 4 years old was how to wait and take turns at games. Really important thing to learn. So if the kid's lining up blocks, then let's take turns lining up blocks. And then teaching skills. Dressing, hand washing, brushing their teeth, just skills. Putting clothes on. Those are the kinds of things I want out of 3-year-olds. Speech, ability to wait and take turns, and skills. And the kids should like going to therapy. And these little ones need a lot of hours of one-on-one. There's been a lot of controversy about ABA. Well, some of the advocates got subjected to some really horrible, old-fashioned, super rigid ABA, where they were driven into sensory overload. That's completely unacceptable. I tell parents with the 3-year-old, how's the teacher engaging the kid? Are you getting progress? Speech, turn taking, and skills, and the child should like going to therapy. And you're getting progress, then you're doing the right thing. But the worst thing you can do with 3-year-olds that are not talking is to do nothing and let them zone out on electronics. That's what you don't do.
We have a question up here from a student.
Did you like the movie that was made about you? Or is it completely?
Did I do what with the movie that was made about me?
Did you like it?
I liked it. And I liked the producer of that movie, a lady named Emily Gerson Sains. She has a severely autistic, nonverbal adult son. She wanted that movie to be right. And it shows my visual thinking absolutely accurately. That's one of the things I like. It's clinically very accurate. It also like illustrates the sensory problems accurately. And I had to make sure all the cattle stuff got done right.
One of the things that I liked about the movie so much was Julie Ormond's portrayal of your mother.
Oh, she did a beautiful job.
Your mother is amazing to me because she was doing all of these things with you long before there was a lot of information out there about what to do.
Well, fortunately, we originally went to a neurologist, and he recommended a speech therapy school. You see, the kind of autistics that were the Asperger types where there's no speech delay. See, most of those, back in the 50s, social skills were taught in a much more systematic way to all children. So the slightly nerdy kid, ended up doing paper routes and got a job and managed to keep good jobs.
And you had a question down here? Okay.
Should I go over there or?
No, just speak up. Yeah.
Okay. As what you had said before, as far as when kiddos have a problem with those loud noises and letting them make that noise, I really love that idea. If a kiddo has a fear though, if we're encouraging them to try and make that noise and they have a fear, what would you suggest on trying to help them overcome that?
Well, they give them absolute control. They can have their hand right there on that vacuum cleaner switch, and make sure the vacuum cleaner that you use has a switch that's easy for the kid to operate. So he can instantly turn it off if it's too loud.
Okay.
Same thing with the hair dryer. I mean, some of these things have switches that are kind of hard to use. The noisemaker needs to have a switch that the child can very easily, instantly turn it off if it's too loud.
Okay.
And then I've talked to now 3 or 4 families where the vacuum cleaners went from most horrible thing, the kid would run out of the room, to favorite thing to play with. Same thing with the electric battery operated leaf blower. Then the kid thinks it's fun to blow the leaves around with it.
Do we have another question?
Well, I do, yeah. And I also, Temple. Temple, I wrote you about 13 years ago about my dog, and it was on, I wrote about defense mechanisms, because you said in your book that in Animals in Translation that dogs don't have defense mechanisms. And I was thinking about my dog Eddie, and anyway, you gave me a great reply back about animals having dominance hierarchies in the top dog.
Well, they do, yeah.
Yeah. And so I'm just wondering, in your life, personally throughout your life, do you have dogs that you have and cats? Like, what animals do you regularly own?
Well, I don't own any now because I'm traveling all the time, but I've often visited with with other people that had animals. And well, I don't know. I'm thinking of a dog where I went to a dinner party one time, and their dog was about ready to jump up on the buffet table. And I looked around and went, and he got right down away from it.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've never owned a dog yourself?
Well, he had them when we were kids.
Yeah.
But and then when I was in high school, I had a dog. Yeah, I had dogs when I was in high school.
Yeah.
But then when I went out to Arizona, I was traveling all the time.
Right.
When I started all my consulting business, I mean, I was doing all out of town. Like, and even now, I thought about getting a dog during COVID, but then I go, now what's going to happen to the dog after COVID? That's not going to be good.
Right.
But I spent lots of time observing animals. I think a lot of dogs today are leading too sheltered a life. There's more problems with them being afraid of the veterinarian because they don't get out and get enough experience having strange people touch them.
We have another question here in the middle.
Hi, Temple. I was curious what you think some of the hardest things are for visual learners compared with verbal learners and communicating with each other.
Well, algebra is like the hardest thing for me. The verbal learners usually have an easier time with that. You see, that math's too abstract. I have no problem with pi times the radius squared for sizing hydraulic cylinders because I see the hydraulic cylinder. that's related right back to something that's real. You know, so I don't have a problem with that. You know, a lot of verbal thinkers are going to go, well, my thoughts jump around. And they don't understand why my thoughts jump around. Then on the other hand, the verbal thinkers leave out too much detail. You see, this happens with a lot of government policy stuff, big, broad concepts, but how do you actually do it? You see, I've been very successful in, I've designed a lot of equipment for the livestock industry, but I also designed a very simple scoring system for evaluating slaughterhouses, where I measure 5 really simple things, so like traffic rules for meat plants, and it worked really, really well. And a lot of evaluation systems get way too complicated. Way too complicated.
James, you had another question?
Yes, you mentioned sensory issues in certain people. What would be your advice for somebody who has issues with touch with certain materials? Like I have an issue with things like clay, where it's just grating on the mind to touch it. It just feels wrong.
Well, and then unfortunately, clay's not something you have to touch, but I have to have things that don't itch against my skin. And I have to wash a lot of clothes that go against my skin, because if something scratches, I can't sit on a plane for 4 hours and something that scratches. I've got to have soft things against my skin. And, you know, then you get things to wear that aren't itchy.
So
That's
exposure.
something you can do.
So exposure therapy, I suppose.
Well, there are certain things where I can get used to some scratchiness, but I'm not going to put wool against my skin. Also, it breaks out. That's the other problem I have. I've got to have soft things against my skin. But one of the problems that I used to have is in the summer, I'd wear shorts. And then in the wintertime, I didn't like the feeling of the pants. So now I just wear pants year round.
Have you ever had problems with long sleeve shirts?
I just wear long sleeve shirts all the time. I mean, basically what I wear for dress clothes and work clothes feels about the same. Yeah, but it's possible to find things that you can wear. I think Einstein liked those soft leather jackets he had because he didn't like scratchy things.
Orange Jacket now has a question.
I have a question.
Okay.
Years ago, not that many, we would have simply said someone has autism or someone is hyperactive. Now we have both directions, scales and degrees of that. And do you feel that that is helpful, or that the labeling issues that have come up, especially in schools, are harmful? Have you dealt with that much?
Well, it depends upon how they're used. Okay, you know, it used to be in the 80s, to be autistic, the kid had to have speech delay. Had to have speech delay. Then the Asperger's came along in the early 90s, and now you have socially awkward with no speech delay. And then in 2013, they merged it all together. Now, when the kids are very little, like I looked very severe when I was very little, and then you kind of work on them really hard, you can pull them out of it. But let's say when parents come up to me and they say, what do I do? What do I do with autistic kids? First of all, I have to know age. You're dealing with a 3-year-old, or, you know, elementary school kid. And then if once they get past about age 6, okay, can they talk? Can they dress themselves? I want to get some idea of their skill level. Okay, now what's the problem? Bullying? They can't do math? Can't stand the sound of the school bell? What's the problem? So I kind of put them in, once they get older, like 3 categories of fully verbal, partially verbal, and then nonverbal. But some of your nonverbals can learn to type independently. So if a kid doesn't learn to type, learn to talk fairly promptly, let's get the iPad out and teach typing. And one of the reasons why you have to use a tablet is because the print has to appear next to the keyboard, because they cannot make the attention shift. Like at this desktop I'm on, I gotta look way down here, and then the print appears up here. I can't make, these autistic guys can't make the attention shift. But some of them can learn to type independently. But it's, you know, the problem is somebody who's, you know, let's say a teenager that's nonverbal needs different services than a kid that's doing normal academics. But I think sometimes the labels get to ruling things too much. As a visual thinker, I don't see the labels. All right, let's see what he can do. Some nonverbals have got good skills for working in greenhouses. That's been a job that's worked out very well. It's but the verbal thinkers tend to get locked into the label. Like the label is not, it's not precise like a tuberculosis diagnosis is precise.
Okay. Do we have any more questions for Temple? Okay.
I have a granddaughter, been diagnosed on the autism spectrum, and her mom would much rather give her an iPhone, tablet to play with instead of a color crayon to color in a color book. How do you convince the parent?
Well, a lot of parents are babying their kids too much. They're not learning enough skills. They're not getting out and learning things. I'm seeing teenagers that are doing well in school that have never gone shopping by themselves. I think this is just ridiculous. And the kids are going nowhere. And then I think about the very autistic guy that built equipment for me that has a zillion patents. This is what drives me crazy as I go back and forth between the worlds.
So show her this.
I see moms that can't let go when I suggest their kid. I said, the next time you're pumping gas, give your kid, I'm talking like a 12-year-old here, fully verbal, a $5 bill and have them go into the shop and buy a jug of milk. You're right there pumping gas. You can see into the shop. And I've talked to moms that said, I don't know if I can get the guts to do that. And the kid is going to go nowhere. You got to get them out doing things and give them choices. Okay, we're going to go shopping today, Target or Walmart, but we're going to one of them. And you're going to help shop for groceries. You see, your granddads that were, didn't have speech delay, they learned all that stuff.
Temple, I want to thank you so much for your time today. All of us here have learned something to take home, and we are very grateful.
Well, for students interested in early education, I have this book right here, The Way I See It. And it's my most basic autism book, a lot of little tiny short chapters that they can read. But one thing I've tried to do is bridge the gap between the educational world and the industrial world. And today I was doing a talk at the biomedical people today. I was just down in Denver. And I tell them, you need the visual thinkers, to help invent things. Then you need the mathematicians to teach the ChatGPT how to discover new drugs. That's going on right now. Oh, it's very good at drug discovery. Very good. It picked out 5 antibiotics out of thousands of chemical combinations, and 2 of them worked.
Well, thank you so much for your time, Temple. I know it's late for you, but
it's not all that late. It's only 7 o'clock. But I've got to call up a lady that wants to talk about jobs for teenagers on the spectrum.
All right, please. Thank you.
Well, it was good to talk to everybody.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, great to talk to everybody. And thank you all for coming.
Thank you.
Have a great
All right, so I'm going to leave the meeting.